Julian Voss had never felt cold like this before. Not the kind of cold that a cashmere coat could fix. Not the kind that vanished the moment a car door closed and the heater kicked in. This was a cold that crawled under the skin and settled into the bones. The kind that reminded a man he was, underneath everything, just flesh. 3 hours earlier, he had been sitting at the head of a mahogany table in the 42nd floor boardroom of Voss Industries, listening to his own board of directors vote to freeze his access to the company's accounts, pending an internal investigation. The accusations were absurd. Fraud, embezzlement, some manufactured paper trail that pointed, conveniently, toward him and away from the man who had actually built it, his own cousin, his own blood. By the time Julian left the building, his corporate card had been deactivated, his driver had mysteriously gone home early, and his phone battery had died somewhere between the elevator and the parking garage, taking with it every contact, every safety net, every version of his life that came with a phone call and a credit card. He told himself it was temporary. Lawyers would fix it by morning. But morning was a long way off, and the city had gone dark and sharp-edged around him. And for the first time in 36 years, Julian Voss did not know a single person he could knock on a door and ask for help. So he walked. Block after block, past restaurants he used to own reservations at, past a hotel where the doorman didn't recognize him without his usual entourage, until his legs simply stopped carrying him anywhere in particular and left him standing at the edge of a small public park 2 miles from everything he owned. The bench was cold iron and weathered wood, half lit by a flickering lamppost. He sat down because his knees gave out before his pride did. That was when he saw her. She was maybe 30 feet away, tucked beneath the low branches of an oak tree, a small mound of blankets and cardboard arranged with a kind of careful precision that spoke of practice. A little girl, no older than 6, was curled against her side, asleep, a threadbare stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The woman herself sat upright, alert, watching the park the way a person watches something that has hurt them before and might again. Julian looked away, embarrassed by his own presence. Embarrassed that a man who owned 3 homes now had less claim to shelter than she did. She, at least, had a system. He had nothing but a suit that cost more than her rent probably ever had, and no idea what to do with himself once the shivering started in earnest. It started around midnight. His teeth were chattering before he even noticed the sound, some involuntary rhythm his body had taken up without asking permission. He pulled his suit jacket tighter, a gesture as useless as it was instinctive, and stared at the ground, willing the night to move faster. "You're new to this." Her voice was quiet, low, not unkind. Julian looked up to find the woman had crossed the small distance between them without his noticing, close enough now that he could see her face properly, tired, lined in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than age, but with eyes that were sharp and clear and entirely unafraid of him. "Excuse me? The bench. The way you're sitting on it. Nobody who's used to the street sits like that. Too stiff, like you're waiting for someone to tell you it's a mistake and you can go home." She studied him for a moment. "You lose your wallet or something?" "Something like that," Julian said, and was surprised by how true it felt to say it plainly, without the qualifiers and explanations that usually followed anything he told a stranger. The woman nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected, and then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the oak tree. Julian assumed that was the end of the conversation. He told himself it didn't matter, that in a few hours this would all be resolved and he'd forget the woman's face, along with everything else about this night. But a few minutes later she was back, and this time she was carrying a blanket. It wasn't much, gray, thin in places, patched along one seam with mismatched thread, but Julian could see, even in the dim light, that it was clean and cared for, and that it was very clearly the only one she had left, besides the one currently draped over her sleeping daughter. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. Julian stared at it, then at her, then at the small sleeping shape under the tree. "I can't take that." "You can, and you will, because you look like you're about 10 minutes from hypothermia, and I've seen what that looks like, and I'm not doing it again." Something flickered across her face when she said it. A memory, brief and unwelcome, before she smoothed it back into practicality. "It's just a blanket. You don't even know me." "I know you're cold," she said simply. "That's enough tonight." He took it, because refusing felt suddenly like an insult to something he didn't fully understand yet, and because his hands were shaking too hard to hold a debate. The wool was rough against his fingers, worn soft in places from years of washing, and it smelled faintly of rain and cedar, and something that might have been laundry soap from a life she no longer had. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant a thank you in longer than he could remember. "Don't mention it." She was already turning to go back to her daughter. "Wait." Julian sat up straighter, the blanket pooling around his shoulders. "At least tell me your name?" She paused, considering him the way a person considers whether a stranger has earned even that much. "Elena," she said finally. "Julian." "Well, Julian." A faint, tired smile crossed her face. "Try to sleep. The bench is easier if you don't fight it." She left him there with the blanket, and the strange, hollow feeling of having received charity from someone who by every measure had less than he did. Julian sat with that feeling for a long time, turning it over, unable to make it fit anywhere in the version of the world he'd occupied that morning. A world where kindness came with a price tag, where every gift had strings, where nobody gave away their last anything without expecting something larger in return. Elena hadn't asked him for a single thing. He didn't sleep, not really, but he stopped shivering, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he found himself watching the small shape of Elena's daughter shift in her sleep, watching Elena tuck the remaining blanket more firmly around the girl before curling herself around the child's back, using her own body as a second layer of warmth now that the first was gone. She had given away her only spare blanket to a stranger, and was now sleeping colder because of it. Julian thought about the 42nd floor boardroom, about the cousin who had smiled at him across the table while dismantling his life piece by piece, about the years he'd spent building walls of glass and steel and lawyers between himself and anyone who might ask something of him without offering value in return. He thought about how easily he had assumed, his whole life, that generosity was a transaction other people performed for cameras and tax deductions. He thought about the blanket around his shoulders, and the woman who slept colder now because of it. And for the first time since the boardroom doors had closed behind him that afternoon, Julian Voss felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold at all. When dawn broke gray and reluctant over the park, Julian was still awake and still wrapped in Elena's blanket, and already turning over a single, stubborn thought that refused to let him go. He needed to see her again. Not to repay her. Repayment, he was beginning to understand, might be the wrong word for what this required, but because something about the last 8 hours had rearranged the furniture of his understanding, and he wasn't ready to let the feeling fade back into the version of himself that existed before it. He folded the blanket carefully, the way he imagined she would have wanted it folded, and walked toward the oak tree just as Elena was stirring, her daughter still curled against her side, the two of them a small, fierce unit, against a world that had given them almost nothing, and asked everything in return. "You're still here," Elena said, sitting up, surprise and wariness both crossing her face at once. "I wanted to return this," Julian said, holding out the blanket, "and I wanted to ask you something." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, the practiced caution of someone who had learned that men who wanted to ask something rarely meant her any good. But there was a stillness in Julian's face that hadn't been there the night before, something that looked less like a stranger and more like a man who had spent the night rebuilding himself from the inside out. "Ask then," she said. Julian opened his mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in his life, that he had absolutely no idea how to explain who he actually was, or why it suddenly mattered so much less than who he wanted to become. "My name is Julian Voss," he said finally. I owned, as of yesterday morning, a company called Voss Industries. You may have heard of it. Most people have, even if they don't realize it. We make the batteries in half the phones in this city." Elena's face didn't change the way he expected it to. No widening eyes, no sudden calculation of what a billionaire's gratitude might be worth. If anything, her expression grew more guarded, not less. "So you're rich," she said flatly, "and you slept on a park bench. My cousin locked me out of every account I have, froze my cards, sent my driver home, staged something that looks enough like fraud to keep me tied up in lawyers for weeks, while he consolidates control of the board. I walked out of that building yesterday afternoon with nothing but the suit on my back And by the time I realized how bad it was too late to call anyone, because I didn't have a phone and I didn't have a single number memorized that wasn't a business line that would be closed until Monday. "So you're rich and stupid," Elena said, but there was the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth now. "Most emergency numbers get memorized for a reason." "I'm learning that," Julian admitted. Her daughter stirred against her side, blinking up with the unguarded curiosity of a child too young to have learned suspicion yet. "Mama, who's that?" "Someone we helped," Elena said, smoothing the girl's hair back. "Julian, this is Sophie." "Hi, Sophie." Julian crouched down, careful to keep some distance, aware suddenly of how large and strange he must look to a 6-year-old who had spent the night 20 feet from a stranger. "That's a good rabbit you've got there." "His name is Butter," Sophie said solemnly. "Because he's yellow. He used to be anyway. Butter's a fine name." Elena watched this exchange with an expression Julian couldn't quite read, something between wariness and the reluctant softening of a person watching a stranger be gentle with the thing she protected most fiercely. She stood, gathering the blanket he'd returned, along with the one Sophie had slept under, folding them both with the same careful precision he'd noticed the night before. "So what's the question?" she said. "The one you came back to ask." Julian straightened. He'd had all night to think about this moment, and somehow still hadn't landed on the right words. "I want to help you, both of you. Not as payment, I know that's not what last night was, but because I have resources most people don't, and I spent the last 12 hours learning what it's like to have none of them, and I can't just walk away from that and pretend I don't know what I know now." "People say that," Elena said, not unkindly, but with the flatness of someone who had heard the sentiment before and watched it evaporate. "They mean it in the moment. Then Monday comes, and the crisis that made them feel something passes, and they go back to their lives, and we're still here." "I don't have a Monday to go back to," Julian said. "Not yet. My accounts are frozen. My name is probably already in 3 news cycles by now, tangled up in whatever story my cousin is feeding the press. I have nothing to offer you today except the fact that I noticed. That has to count for something, even if it's small." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her eyes that Julian couldn't name. Finally she exhaled, and some of the guardedness eased, just slightly, like a door opening a few inches rather than swinging wide. "There's a shelter 3 blocks from here. They do breakfast at 7. If you want to actually understand what you think you learned last night, come with us. See what the rest of it looks like in daylight." It wasn't the answer Julian had expected, but it was, he realized, exactly the kind of answer that mattered. The shelter was a converted community center, its linoleum floors scuffed pale by decades of feet, its walls covered in construction paper murals made by children who came and went with the seasons of their family's luck. Julian stood in line behind Elena and Sophie, aware of the stares he drew. Not because anyone recognized him, stripped of his usual context, but because his suit, even wrinkled and slept in, marked him as someone who didn't belong. He ate eggs from a paper plate at a folding table and listened to Elena talk quietly with a woman named Grace who ran the front desk, and learned in fragments, never all at once, never more than Elena chose to give, the shape of how she and Sophie had ended up here. A husband who'd left before Sophie turned 2. A job at a warehouse that had closed without warning. A landlord unwilling to wait even 1 month for rent while she searched for new work. A city that offered exactly enough safety net to keep a person from disappearing entirely, and not 1 thread more. "It's not a tragedy," Elena said at one point, catching the look on his face. "It's just what happens to a lot of people. We're not special. We're just visible to you right now, which most of the time we aren't." The words landed harder than he expected. Julian had spent a career quantifying value in numbers large enough to lose the humans inside them. Market share, quarterly growth, headcount reductions phrased in language soft enough to disguise what they actually meant. He had never once, in 36 years, sat across a folding table from the numbers and watched them eat eggs and worry about whether their daughter's shoes still fit. By mid-morning, a payphone call to his lawyer, the only line he still had memorized, confirmed that the board freeze was, as expected, a manufactured mess, and that his access would be restored by end of day, pending an emergency shareholder review. Relief flooded through him, fast and dizzying, followed almost immediately by something heavier, The awareness that his ordeal was ending in hours, while Elena's had no such deadline. No lawyer was coming for her. No board would vote to restore anything. "I have to go deal with this," he told her, once the call was finished. "But I'm coming back. Today. Not with an apology and a check that makes me feel better and disappears from your life by next week. I want to actually help. A real job if you want one. Somewhere stable for you and Sophie to live. Whatever version of this makes sense to you. Not to me." Elena's jaw tightened. "I don't need saving, Julian. I know. That's not what I'm offering. I spent one night on that bench, and it broke something open in me that I don't think can close back up. And I'd rather do something useful with that than let it fade into a good story I tell at dinner parties." He hesitated. "I'm asking you to let me try. You can say no, but I'd like the chance." She was quiet for a long moment. Sophie's small hand curled in hers, the noise of the shelter kitchen clattering on around them. "If you disappear," she said finally, "if this is just guilt talking, and it fades by tomorrow, that's fine. People do that. But don't come back here and pretend it didn't happen. Don't make Sophie wonder why the nice man from the park stopped visiting. I won't disappear. We'll see." It took Julian 4 days to make good on it. Days spent untangling the mess his cousin had made. Days spent in rooms with lawyers and board members and reporters who wanted to know why the reclusive Voss heir had suddenly been photographed leaving a homeless shelter, looking like he hadn't slept in a proper bed in a week. He didn't explain the photograph to anyone but the people who mattered. He didn't need the story to be public to know it was real. On the 5th day, he went back to the park. Elena wasn't under the oak tree. For one lurching moment, Julian felt the old cold from the bench return, sharper now, the fear that she and Sophie had moved on, that the city had swallowed them, the way it swallowed so many people who slipped through the net he was only now beginning to understand existed. Then he saw Grace from the shelter, walking a group of kids across the grass, and she pointed him 3 blocks over, to a small apartment building with a temporary housing placard in the window. Elena opened the door still in her work clothes, a diner uniform he'd learned, secured through a connection Grace had made. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You came back," she said finally, something unguarded in her voice for the first time. "I told you I would." Sophie appeared behind her mother's legs. Butter the rabbit clutched tight, and broke into a grin at the sight of him that undid something in Julian's chest, more thoroughly than any boardroom victory ever had. "I'm not here to fix everything today," Julian said. "I know that's not how it works, and I know you'd tell me if I was doing this wrong. But I'd like to keep coming back, not because you need saving, because somewhere on that bench, I stopped being someone who walked past things, and I don't want to go back to being him." Elena looked at him for a long moment, the wariness finally, fully giving way to something warmer underneath. "The diner does a decent cup of coffee," she said, "if you're not too important for that anymore." "I was never too important for that," Julian said. "I just didn't know it yet." She stepped aside to let him in, and for the second time in less than a week, Julian Voss found himself somewhere he had no right to expect a welcome, and was given one anyway. Not because of anything he owned, but because of who he had decided, one cold night on a park bench, to become.